That's great. Okay, I guess we're going to get started. Tonight we have Merrill Roberts here in the seminary. Lead us in an opening prayer. Thank you, George.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you this evening as you bring us together to discuss and to better understand education and coming to know you better through education. We ask you this evening to send your Holy Spirit upon us that we might be enlivened and enlightened, to better discuss and to come to know you better, to know your Son better, and to lead others to know you better. We ask this in all things in the name of Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, God, forever and ever. Amen. St. Jerome, pray for us. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
All right, good evening. It's good to see all of you. Thank you for joining us here and remotely. My name is Taryn Okuma, and I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the English department here at Catholic University. We are very excited to be co-sponsoring this event with St. Jerome Institute's Society for the Renewal of the Catholic Mind. Before we begin our conversation, I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers. So first, Daniel Gibbons is the current chair of the St. Jerome Institute Board. He is associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in English at the Catholic University of America. He's a founding member of the SJI board and co-author of the SJI curriculum plan. He helped to author Catholic University's undergraduate core curriculum and serves on the CUA Secondary Education Council, which helps to oversee the training of high school teachers at the university. Dr. Gibbons has also assisted with teacher formation at St. Jerome Academy and St. Jerome Institute. Merrill Roberts is a lecturer in physics here at the Catholic University of America, a senior faculty consultant for the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education, and a nature studies teacher for 5th through 8th graders at St. Jerome Academy. His doctoral and postdoctoral work through NASA Goddard Space Flight Center investigated solar coronal transients and performed forward modeling for the Parker Solar Probe mission. Along with his wife, Elizabeth, Dr. Roberts is also the co-director of music at St. Jerome's Parish. Edward Trudeau is Director of Planning and Institutional Research at Catholic University. He's taught middle school, high school, and college students mathematics, logic, and philosophy. He was a member of the original St. Jerome Academy Curriculum Committee, a founding member of the SJI board, and a co-author of the SJI curriculum plan. He currently serves as vice chair of the SJI board and is the chair of the SJI curriculum committee. Mr. Trudeau has also assisted with teacher formation at St. Jerome Academy and St. Jerome Institute. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn things over to all of you.
Thank you, Taryn. So I guess I should stand. I thought use this one? Well, this one works, right? Do I need both? I'll just here I am. So tonight we're going to talk about the future of Catholic education as we see it. It's a pretty grandiose claim that we would have much to say about that. The future is a pretty big thing, but I think it's a great time for Catholic education. There's a lot of opportunity that arises when people start to look around and become dissatisfied. And I think a lot of Catholics are becoming dissatisfied with what the Catholic schools often offer them. And they're becoming concerned about their children's future. So the St. Jerome Project has for over 10 years sought to find a good response, sought to find a path to the future, to a bright future for Catholic education. And this society, the Society for the Renewal of the Catholic Mind, hopes to expand that beyond the boundaries of a parish school, St. Jerome Academy, an independent high school, St. Jerome Institute, and to a broader community of parents and Catholics who care about education and who want to share in that bright future and build it together. We have a really nice opportunity right now for dialogue about this, because about a year ago, the Vatican issued an instruction on Catholic schools that in part renewed perennial teachings that have been around for a long time, and in part emphasized and intensified certain aspects of the Catholic view of what a school should be and the place of a school in society. And I, for one, found that document extremely encouraging. I think there's a lot of really great stuff in there. Tonight, we're not here to do a deep dive into that document, to do any kind of thorough overview of it. It's a rich document. There's a lot there. That's not our purpose tonight. I think, if you're looking for further reading, I would look for the writings of Archbishop Michael Miller. He has some great stuff that attempts to unfold for a non-theologian audience the significance and the promise of recent Vatican teachings on education. Tonight, we are responding to that document and to a few ideas in that document that we also have seen in other teachings over the last decade or so that seem really important and seem to bear a lot of promise. And they're things that that we hope, as we can go more deeply into these ideas, they'll also inform our community. And we're hoping to inspire more conversation beyond tonight. So tonight, I hope we'll get a conversation started about a few important ideas in a very important document. And I encourage everybody to go out and read it and to study it. But I encourage everybody also to keep talking about it after tonight and tonight as well. I hope we'll have some good conversation at the end. So the structure of our conversation will be more or less, we want to talk about two phrases that seem like key phrases to us in recent Vatican teachings about Catholic education. One is integral education, and the other is a culture of dialogue. These phrases bear a lot of weight in church teachings on schools and education, but it's not obvious to non-theologians what those phrases might mean. So I think tonight we're going to try to unpack a little what they mean to us and some of our thoughts about the importance of those phrases and the ideas that are behind them and the church teachings that are behind them. So I'm going to join these guys and we're going to have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll invite you to join in. So I think we'd like to start by talking about integral education.
Okay, well, let me offer a couple of reflections that maybe can get the conversation started. So in mathematics and philosophy, there's a very particular definition for integral. It means something that is a whole, it's irreducible, can't be divided, right? It's integral, it's like the integers, right? They're whole numbers. Like an organism is alive, it's not half alive, it's alive. and a person is an integral whole. So that's one thing that I'd like to think about. Education, I think I'd like to look at it in two different ways. In one sense, I'd like to look at it as the program and the context in which you form students. So that's the building, the schedule of courses, the faculty, subjects taught, the books read, and so forth. That's education. But it also has a sense in which it's reflected from the standpoint of the person who is formed, as in my education. Right? I'm educated. And because I am an integral whole, it's not part of me that's educated, or part of me that's formed. I am formed as an integral whole. So when we think about integral education, there's these two senses of a whole program or curriculum that can be thought of as one entire whole that we present. And then there's a sense in which an individual is wholly transformed by that education, because the individual is him or herself an integrated whole.
So, practical terms, how well the document places some emphasis on integral education. It talks about integral human development as a central to the church's educational work. It talks about integrating the transmission of knowledge. So how well did we do that? If that's an essential part of the mission of Catholic schools, what does it mean in the life of a school to be integrated, to have an integrated curriculum, a curriculum that's whole? And what does it mean to promote integration in persons? How well do we do that? How do we do that? That's what we're called to do in Catholic education. How do we achieve it?
I guess it's hard because at the beginning, when you well, I guess at first when you try to crack a problem, there tends to be analysis, right? There tends to be a breaking up and a making of distinctions, and it seems like in some ways that's the natural way to go. Well, I have these parts and pieces, and what are all the parts I need, right? And so there's a tendency to analysis, right? And it's sort of how can I break this down to its elements, right? And in some ways you can get kind of stuck there. And it seems to me that in a lot of ways the document is calling us to remember that we have to find the unity, right? To find the whole, to integrate these things back together. And so it's interesting because one answer to that question might be, look, all the parts and pieces are here. Right? I have all the parts and pieces, right? And maybe it's all the parts and pieces of a human life. Maybe it's the academic part, and we have the service part, and we have the whatever other parts you want to put together and say this is a whole life. Here are all the parts. They add up to a whole human life. But it seems that the document is really calling us to more than that, and to sort of and not even just more than that, but to look at any analysis we might make in the breaking down of this is what I'm doing for this 20 minutes or this hour, and how they come together in a unified whole. At least insofar as the hierarchy, it's not like there's not a distinction between mathematics and history necessarily, or different parts of it in the soul that should make, but that the focus that there needs to be a refocusing on the unifying principle, right? And the principle together.
From a biological analogy, we can say that a healthy organism has healthy systems. Right. And the circulatory system is working, the nervous system is working, the digestive system is working. But the thing that holds it all together is its light. And if you remove the light from it, then in a sense, it doesn't matter how healthy the systems were. It's an analogy, so I don't want to push it too far. But there is a sense in which when we're forming students, we have to pay attention to the entire life that we're forming and to consider it as you say, in individual distinct areas. I'm going to form them physically here, I'm going to form them intellectually here, I'm going to form them spiritually here. I'm going to give them a service project. I can do each of those very well, but still remain in these silos that keep them from truly being an integral whole.
Well, I don't want to, this is the Catholic talk, but it's not the confessional, so I won't give too many personal stories, but as, from a teaching perspective, there's a way in which you look at the life thing. But I think we've all had experiences, hopefully, maybe you're blessed to not have experiences, but I've had experiences, whereas as a student, you might feel as if your education is lifeless, though you happen to be checking all the boxes and doing all the things you need to do, right? And you're running through and making sure you do all the checking off all the things in the list of responsibilities, and I fulfilled all my responsibilities as a good student, but you don't feel as if that education has life or is organic to who you are, or that there's one thing you could say that says this is why I feel compelled to pursue this education. The experience of the student also, as you were saying earlier, right? That there's the building in the curriculum, but then there's also the I who is educated, right? And that person who is being told they're on the conveyor belt, right? And all the parts and pieces are being placed on does not themselves have a sense maybe of the life, you know, and then can feel kind of dead to the student, right?
Right, so this is our responsibility. It's the responsibility of parents.
Right.
It's the responsibility of teachers. It's the responsibility of school administrators to know that, or to have a vision of it anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Because of course you can't know it until you become it. In the inhabiting of it only, and you have a sense of the whole. When you're trying to become an adult, how could you possibly know what an adult even is, right? And right, so this is our responsibility, I think, and it's a grave responsibility, and I'm afraid one that often is not thought through very well. It's not given enough attention by families, by teachers. People trust that, well, I got a book, and the book says math, right? So this must be good. It's got, you know, some smart people put their stamp on this book, right? I've got a book and it says American literature. So it must be a good book because it's, you know, this is the book on literature in America. And there's not, yeah, I think it is very hard. It's very hard for folks to be attentive to that question. Where is the home? What is the vision of the thing? And it's something I'm really used to as a student of literature, because our whole enterprise is about trying to see the unseen. You've got all these scattered marks on a page, and it's just a bunch of squiggles and lines and dots and stuff, right? And it forms into words, right? But it's, if you rearrange even 2 or 3 of the words, you can completely change the meaning. And so seeking after the whole thing that you can't really see, it's not even there, right? There's no book about the whole thing. Right. There's no book that could just tell you perfectly the exact nature of the interrelation of all the subjects. I think some philosophers have attempted such things, but I think that they're, you know, that enterprise is flawed because it lacks an acknowledgement of something that I think this document is pretty wise about. The acknowledgement that it's not just one thing. There's an organicism. That a school and an education happens in a time and a place. It happens with particular persons. And so the forms of the relations among the parts, in order to be truly alive, can't just be one thing. You can't just get the formula down and then make sure every school perfectly adheres to that little formula, and then you're done. You've solved education, right? That can't work. So, but that's really scary. That's daunting. But then what are you supposed to do? How are we supposed to improve this thing if nobody knows what the thing is? The church is calling us, you know, to some impossible quixotic endeavor, perhaps, right? Trying to discover the undiscoverable, see the invisible.
Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Yeah, right. So practically speaking, how can we respond to the problem? If we look around and we see a common problem in schools at every level of a lack of an understanding of how you can take all these words and pull them together into a poem that's really meaningful. How you can take all the Legos and build them into a beautiful little model of the Taj Mahal. How you can take all the organs and pull them together into a living creature with a life of its own. How can we take all these areas of knowledge that we think we know something about and make a living whole of it? In our time, in our place, for our people, how do we make this happen?
As a way of approaching that question, or to quote something from the St. Jerome educational plan. It says, everything that a school does educates. So every choice that you make, from what's hanging on the walls, to what you put in the student handbook, to faculty and how they come together and form a community, all of that stuff is teaching, sometimes not directly, not as a person lecturing to another person, but it's informing, and by informing is forming all of these students and the faculty and the families. So when we think about adding something, suppose we think, you know, our community lacks a good service learning component. So the approach that I often hear about that, well, let's go out and look and see what are other people doing with service learning. Let's go talk to some other high schools and or grade schools, and like, how do they do that? Oh, they help out at soup kitchens, or they go to retirement homes and spend some time with people who are living there. You know, there's all these different sort of accepted activities that you can do, and they're all in and of themselves, they're good activities. But when you want to add that into your school community, into the life of your school, I think you have to think about how it impacts every aspect of your school. Where does it fit in the school day, like in the schedule? How are students brought into that service learning component? Who leads it? What's the, how do you form students to be good servers? Thinking about that, how does it impact families? How can families be involved? So you always want to think about it as the same way you would think about adding something into your own life. It's going to impact every other thing that you're doing. And some of those may seem like tangential impacts, but you should at least intentionally know we're considering that to be tangential. It shouldn't just be an accident that it had nothing to do with the athletics program, because lo and behold, a month later, it could turn out that it conflicts with practice time. Because you didn't really think about how the whole thing works together.
Yeah, and this often, on a practical level, it's so hard to consider everything, right? Sometimes you don't know. So like it's rolling, right? But on a practical level, it can lead you to then disregard these things and treat them as vestigial almost. If we're using the biological analogy, you can sort of keep adding these limbs. Oh, this looks great in isolation. This is great in isolation. We're definitely adding this component. And then it comes to be that these things are in conflict. And there's a way in which the student or even families can say, oh, well, this part of the whole doesn't matter. Or clearly they didn't consider, these are all now optional is the wrong word, but sort of like, I think vestigial probably is a nice place to be with the analogy, right? Because you say it's not really part of the core of the school. But I think part of the across both the document and some of the things that we've tried to say in the school is that everything the school chooses to do should be chosen in its relation to the core of what the school is, and then in relation to who the student is. And that those things, the more you consider them, the better it's going to be, because it can, and you know this is true, it can, when there's too many conflicts, it leads to it being abandoned or laid off the side or seen as not integral to the school, and then it can languish or turn into something which then takes away from other programs that you might think are more essential or more part of the school. It can bring a lot of frustration.
Do your 20 service hours, report them on a form, bring them back in, okay, you check the box. What have you learned about serving?
And it seems totally disconnected, except insofar as the form passes from your hand to the hand from every other part of those kind of schools, it's a bag you're holding or something like that, you can drop it at any time, right? Not that it's an integral part of the corpus of what's going on at the school.
It seems like there are at least I see two things going on here that are pretty important then to think about. We're trying to improve the integral character of education in our homes or in our schools. One is, right, the idea that a kind of caution maybe about treating extracurriculars as too extra, right? Or
Yeah.
accepting the idea of the extracurriculars as part of the life of a school or of a family, that there's anything extra that you know, if I go to a soup kitchen and I serve there weekly, and I come home every week afterwards, right, and continue on my life, and nothing else changes in my life. It has no other impact on my life. I'm probably doing it wrong, right? From the Catholic perspective, I'm probably doing it wrong. I'm serving wrong, right? That's like wrong. I don't know. There's something wrong about that charity because somehow I'm able to box it off from everything else, and it's not integral.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a divided man, and it seems like what we're looking for is a greater unity, coherence in our lives, right? And that education plays an important part of that. So for students, then, analogously, if this is something I'm going to quote Edward here. This is something he says to me before and others. But if you change something in your literature class in your school and has no impact whatsoever on what's going on in your math class in your school, that should be cause for concern. Are you creating integral education? Really? Right? I mean, because if I cut off my left hand, it's gonna matter to the whole system, right? It's gonna change a lot in the whole system of my body and my life, right? And I can't just switch that out, right? It's not an interchangeable part. If I stick a hook on there or a robot hand, everything still has to change everywhere else. It's a fantasy to think that it won't. So similarly with the curriculum, right? It seems like the notion of the extracurricular is something we ought to be cautious with. And we ought to be thinking, how if we're making a choice about service, if we're making a choice about what we're going to present to students in our math class, if we're making a choice about what the history class is going to do today, right? Or anywhere in your curriculum or the whole life of your school, and it doesn't really matter what's happening. Well, that's probably a place for further reflection, right? And further growth.
And to pretend it doesn't have an effect, it ends up in frustration and contempt, maybe just in the fruit, right? Because no matter how extracurricular you think the extracurricular thing is, it does have an effect on your class, right? Even at the collegiate level, right? You've got students coming to you saying, I'm gonna miss your class because I'm doing sports. I'm out to stay. It's part of their life at the collegiate level. Even though it's disparate, you might even know what's going on, you might not have control over it, it's still gonna affect your classes. And you might think you have nothing to do with the choral program at your school until suddenly the choir's going on a trip and you were gonna give a math test. And that's, so as a teacher, the more you can see that up front and the more you see it as an integral part of your student's education, the less jarring it is, the less frustrating it will for you as a student, and the more you say, yes, this is a sacrifice, a compromise, a give and take between the parts of the body that we planned for, right? And then that I accept, right? That I'm not upset when the whole class is on the bus to Gettysburg to go do the history recitation in the spring, and I'm not mad at Mrs. Clayton because she's taking the night because I know that's an integral part of their education.
Because it's the administrators, it's whomever is in charge, right? You have reflected with the other people in charge about that step of reflection has to be there. That's right. You have to stop. But is this really the right thing to do? Right? Or is there some reason why we just can't do that? Or why we really ought to just be doing something else, even though that seems like the convenient or the typical thing to do, and gosh, won't our kids be missing out on this box stop experience that everybody gets to do? Well, who cares if you miss out on some experience, if you have other experiences that are actually useful experiences. But the second thing to think about that's related to this, right, is the idea that's in the St. Jerome Academy plans, one of the foundational ideas of St. Jerome Academy education. That is that you're trying to figure out how to do this stuff. Trying to figure out how to build a curriculum. It's like trying to build a cathedral, right? You don't just say, well, okay, cathedrals have naves and they've got pews and they've got flagstones and they got pillars and they've got gold and they got windows. All right, let's just get a pile of that stuff, right? And we'll put all the windows over there and we'll put all the pillows over there and pillars over there. And we'll put the flagstones over there, and we got our cathedral, right? You can't do that. Right? You start by thinking about a cathedral. Where are you going? What are you trying to build? Well, same thing with the person, or at least analogously with the person, an observation, it's part of the inspiration of that plan. Yeah, think about who you're hoping students should be. Who do you want your children to be? Who do you want your students to be? Where are you trying to get to with them? Where are you trying to be? And it seems to me like, so there's this interior kind of integration where you're trying to reflect and pull together the many pieces of a thing and make sure that they're in a wholesome living relationship with each other, an organic relationship with each other. But then when you're forming persons, you're not forming persons for the school exactly, right? You're forming persons for a life. And that life is a life that's lived in community with other human beings in a particular place, in a particular time. And so also seems to me, right, that when you're making those kind of choices, it seems really important to think about who's this going to make the students for their community, right? When they go and serve in soup kitchens, right? Is this going to more integrally connect them to the real persons who could conceivably have an impact on their lives, to whom they're going to become obligated, right? Is it going to matter that they see that person every Thursday? Is that going to change their lives? Are they maybe going to see that person more than Thursday out on the street pushing a cart and have a further obligation to that person that the soup kitchen has prepared them for? Is it going to call them into a deeper relation with the persons in their actual lived communities? This is, I think, a really important aspect of the Synchrome Institute plan had in mind in thinking about forming older students, forming them toward that's sort of the last jumping off place before adulthood. Notion that a school really ought to have a mind for how the work that it does connects with its local community. The kind of important outward facing aspect to a school that needs to be connected, needs to build up a connection between young people, stronger connection between young people and their families, between young people and their parishes, between young people and their local civic communities.
So maybe I can push that a little bit. It seems to me that the simple response to that is, sure, we have some service program too. So I guess in some ways, if we're trying to do something, if you think there's something innovative or something different about the perspective or the integrity of what that is for the school, it seems like, sure, you go out and work in your community, the soup kitchen, if you're doing landscaping, or whatever you have to be doing, working grounds, or we do that. We load food trucks. I got that box checked over here. Like on the surface reading, that looks very much the same as what is going on. But the implication of what you're saying seems to be that you're hoping that what you're doing is both distinct and more human and calling into something deeper. So maybe you can just say a little bit about what you think the distinction is between, or what you think practical differences are, or sort of the organization differences, choices that were made in the way that that was thought through, that can then be distinguished in the fruits, either in the students or in the community.
Well, I'd say any school that's actually doing that is doing it right. I wouldn't want to distinguish myself from that aspect of their
Yeah.
work. I think that what was important to us is articulating that as a guiding principle at the center of the education plan, not as something that maybe happens or maybe doesn't happen. That's understood and reflected upon with respect to not just that you happen to be doing work in your community, which is good, right? And if you are, that's good, right? Great stuff, right? You're not shipping your kids off to some totally other community, where the poor people live or whatever, and they can go be, virtue tourists for a little while and maybe do some real genuine service. I don't want to disparage that too much, right? Maybe, be transformed to some extent by that. But the obligation is very little, much of the time in that kind of work. But yeah, if schools are really helping their students to dig roots in and intertwine those roots with their communities, then I'd say they're doing that aspect right. But the question is whether, like we were talking about before, whether that's understood as part of the central work of the school and whether that's carried back into the life of the school and everything else that is. To what extent does that work intertwine with a set of social obligations that actually form the I think we're informed by our obligations to people rather more than by our desire, like sort of temporary.
And I pull that back just a little bit, that same principle exists within the classroom curriculum as well, right? You don't read the Odyssey because, well, high school students should have seen the Odyssey because that's what cultured people have read, right? And when you read the Odyssey, even if you read it for many of the right reasons, there's still a way in which you want the student to be formed by reading the Odyssey. There are specific questions raised and answered or proposed in the Odyssey. And you should have some understanding of why it was included in the curriculum, why it was included, where it was, why it has reference or how it has reference to other things in the curriculum. And at first, that might seem like, well, that's an impossible idea. I can't actually plot. I'm reading chapters, 4 to 9 today, and I need to make sure that, natural philosophy you guys are covering, that kind of an integration is probably right. It's probably a step too far, but there is a sense in which those silos have to be addressed. And a sense in which we have to think about the subjects that we're teaching, not simply as their self-contained subjects with their own inner principles, which they have, but also how they fit together with everything else. And since that's not typically done when you go and buy something from Scholastic or Pearson, you're going to have to think about it yourself a little bit from scratch.
Well, and again, about obligation, I don't want to harp on it too much, but another part of the integration of the life of the school is like the integration of the life of the family. It's among the persons there, and it's not just the kids, right? And, the teachers have a life together. And in some ways, their life together is more the reality of the school than the students' experience of it. The students come into that life and experience it for 4 years, and then they're gone in the high school, right? Or in college. But those relationships, that community of philosophical friends among teachers, that's a community that I would argue, if it's well ordered, does have a sense of obligation. Yeah, there are limits to what you can do past, but you can always approach closer and closer and closer to the sorts of ideals of a kind of what's school like in heaven, right? Where it's perfect, everything's perfectly integrated in some magnificent way at every single moment. You're thinking, like Dante, you're thinking math and music and poetry and biology all at the same, and theology all at the same moment, right? And this sort of the half-box, right? But But you can approach that, but I think that the work together of seeking stability and the sense of obligation to each other among the teachers is an aspect of creating a life that's in school, that's in.
And you can't give what you don't have, and you can't love what you don't know, right? So if the teacher wants to help the students bring them into that life, they have to have that experience themselves.
So they gotta study each other's stuff.
They study each other's subjects well, and you know, when I talk to other teachers, when I talk to other schools, it can be, this is a daunting, frightening thing. It's a grave responsibility, right? You see the apostles shudder many times in Christ says, "This is the call." You know, I'm sorry, what? You know, and it's a beautiful call, but in some ways, the litmus test is not that bad. In the perfect world, in the well integrated curriculum, the question, when am I ever going to use this, or what does it have to do with anything, never comes up. Not because they've been beaten into submission to never ask that question, but rather because it's never even occurs to the student, right? Where does this fit? Because you've already shown them in the curriculum and the class that you're presenting to them. And funny that I use the American history recitation at St. Jerome Academy, where the students go and sort of memorize a bunch of books from American history and then go present them. Because I was thinking about that as an HLA teacher, and I was like, hey, they're not in my class today because they're having a recitation practice. Except then we were doing plant biology with 7th grade, and there was a small mutiny, I confess, when they realized they had been growing seedlings, and then we were going to experiment upon them. And there was a strong, the community rose up against me and said, "This shall not be. I've raised this from a seedling." And I said, "Well, this is what you're raising them for." And I was then presented with the American history recitation redone for plants' rights. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All plants are created. I have a dream that one day my seedling shall be judged. You know, there was a long list done in some people are in the audience whose students were involved, whose children were involved in this. And I thought to myself, yes, this is why they're missing my classroom American history recitation, because when they see something that is even a sort of humorously perceived injustice, they know how to respond to it in a way that comes from some other class. And I just thought, what a beautiful proof, right? They didn't say, "Oh, my American history, has nothing to do with the plant biology we're studying." Initially, they said, "Oh, we know how to rebut Dr. Roberts' position on this. We're going to save our plants by talking about human rights and what we know from the American founding." I thought, what a beautiful. They didn't ask that. What does that have to do with anything? The more you could present a school in which that question never occurs to the mind of the student, the more I think in some ways you've done your job, because they see in a sort of organic way where things go. Right? They don't say, "I don't really need a stomach. Heart, spleen, nothing. No, we don't need that. We just take that. But it's not going to really affect my life. Like, if I don't take that class." Right? But they know where it fits. And then if for some reason some practical things comes up where it's something where you don't get the fullness of that, there's a loss, and they know what that loss is, because we're in a fallen world and we don't always get everything perfectly, either in the plan or in the execution. And then they feel that loss, right? In a certain way. Not that we set it up that way, but then they know it was integral.
I think we should at least mention the very common phrase that we hear about truth being one. And so everything that addresses or partakes in the truth has this unity by virtue of the fact that it participates in truth. And the typical analogy is light. The brightest light is composed of all the colors. In a sense, that also has something to do with the integral education that school provides. And of course, that truth is Jesus Christ. And so ultimately, all things are tied together through him and through reference to that. Not in the sense of, well, we have to, quote a section of something from the gospel for every topic that we're studying, but in the sense that it's always part of the understanding. It's always part of the ground by which we're understanding what it is that we're studying.
Yeah. So we're trying to conform ourselves to the truth, right? Once you throw out one of those nice lines, right? What is this for? Virtue. You're trying to conform ourselves to the truth. You think there's objective integration because there's a unity from the Creator in all reality, right? Through whom all things were made, right? And therefore, if the curriculum is presenting the student with truth and trying to conform them to reality, there's a way in which the curriculum needs to be integrated in order to rightly represent the reality which we're trying to show to the students. And the result of that is what I think Dan was maybe even explicitly saying earlier, is that the result of that curriculum which is integrated in order to reflect the integration of reality is the internal subjective integration of the student. The student knows where the parts of themselves fit together, and all of those parts of themselves that have been brought out to flourish have an interconnectedness to them, and there's a integration within the soul of the student, ideally speaking, right? Yeah, and Bill's one next one, you know, that's wow.
No, that's beautiful. And in fact, I think we probably ought to shift now to our second phrase that we wanted to talk about.
Which has been embodied.
I know, exactly, right? So it's integrated of our event tonight. Right. And it's in the title of this instruction, right? The title, The Identity of the Catholic School for a Culture of Dialogue. I think there's a wonderful moment early on in the introduction to the document where it calls attention to something important that Pope Francis pointed out. He says, they quote him here, "We cannot create a culture of dialogue if we do not have identity." An interesting thing, right? So we have to figure out what Catholic identity really means. What is that, right? But then we have to figure out, okay, once we inhabit a really authentic Catholic identity, how can we enter into dialogue? What does it mean to be in a culture of dialogue? That this document and so many of the teachings on education that we get from our religious leaders are pointing. Once again, I'm going to ask Edward, what is the culture of dialogue, Edward? It's like my life.
I'm give me some thoughts that I have that can start a conversation, a dialogue, if you will. So a culture of dialogue obviously implies a culture, but I don't take culture to be the accidental result of a group of individuals coming together and doing something together. When I see culture used in this way, I think about an intentional community that's created, that something which is nourished, something which is cherished, something which is created with a purpose. That's the culture that we're building. Okay, so that's I assume that that's the implication, and from Pope Francis's quote about there not being a culture without identity, it seems like he's thinking of it in that way as well. So for dialogue, in order for there to be a dialogue, there has to be at least two speakers. If I'm talking and you're listening, it's a monologue or a lecture. So a dialogue has at least two speakers. And if it's truly a dialogue, then both speakers have some personal contribution to make to the dialogue. It's not one person correcting another person and the other person saying, okay, I understand, right? It's two people making a contribution. We'll stop there. It's not necessarily, I'm not making any judgment on values of those contributions, but there are two personal contributions to make. And then the third thing, which ought to go without saying, but I have to say it, is you have to have a conversation. If I want a culture of dialogue, then I actually have to dialogue in my culture. And if I'm talking about a school, there has to be conversation in the school. There has to be dialogue in the classroom. There has to be dialogue between the students and the teachers, between the students and their peers, between the teachers, between the school and the families. Those conversations have to be throughout the culture. The culture is intentionally constructed around dialogue. And I think that that's something that we really need to explore in contemporary American education, and something that I think we really try to do in the St. Jerome Educational Plan. Talk about how do we have conversations in the classroom rather than instruction.
This is clear out practice.
I think one thing to say in my own experience is that there's, as with so many things, in the good light, right? They have to start with humility. The teacher has to presuppose that the student has something to tell them. And the student also has to presuppose the teacher has something to tell them that has worth, right? That there's a way in which that has to come. I guess part of the question is about having a conversation, right? Not just pausing for you to take a breath, like you jump in with what I already decided to say, but in fact, responding to what you actually said, because the assumption is we both have something to say, and I guess that there's humility, but also responsibility, right? That there's, as you were saying earlier, there's a planning, there's a responsibility in integrating, but then that there's a responsibility to come with something to say, or at least come open to thinking about the topic, such that you then have something to say, right? Rather than coming, as in, here I am as an empty jar. Your job is to pull me up and get me to the top before I have to leave. To bring the students into that early. So I guess humility and personal responsibility, and maybe you need to ask for it early on. I guess that's from a personal level, from an institutional level, from a planning level. I guess there's other things.
I'd like to go back to that, in that culture, we're trying to nurture and grow that culture. And so there's, in a conversation, when you're teaching a toddler how to talk and you're coaching them, you still want that toddler to be giving you phrases and to be trying out things, and you coach them along, right? You don't typically tell them, no, that's not how you say it this way. You repeat the correct phraseology. You're trying to bring them into the ability to have a conversation. So, yeah, so you'll ask students, what do you think, Dante means by this thing, right? And they'll have some opinion on it, and you say, where do you see that?
Yeah.
What in what he's written makes you think that that's what it means, or how do you think that has impact on what was said earlier, right? So you're coaching them in that dialogue, and they're starting to learn how to have those conversations. But you are actually having a conversation rather than, as so often is the case, okay, we read Dante, here's what he meant by that. Here's how this ties into, right? You're sort of giving them the end of the story without allowing them to explore and try to understand on their own, trying to struggle with it and be with it for a moment. So I think that part of that is pedagogical, and there has to be a sense that this is the work of the school. Not that this is, I've got the following 12 points that I need to get through, and I need to make sure that they've mastered all the points, and then I can move on to the next set of points or the next reading or the next lesson. But that this is the goal of the school, is to get them to be able to do this.
Right.
And so you have to be able to dwell with that for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and that's a lifelong project, right? I think that's really important. That sometimes people have sort of romantic ideas about children that are not actually very helpful. You get into this idea of like, you come to the child and you expect, you wonder at the wisdom of the child, and sure, there's a kind of deep wisdom of a sort, that wisdom that the children have, but it's the wisdom of fools, right? And it's a paradoxical kind of wisdom.
Not my child. It may be exemplar.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But so anyhow, but right. So I think there's something about dialogue, about real dialogue, where you have to respect who they really are, right? You have to respect their limitations that are natural to them, that are proper to them, or that are unnatural to them, that are deformations that have happened to them that shouldn't be. So you have to respect that about them as much as you have to respect them as somebody who also has something to offer because they're in the image of God. And so I do think it's not that there is no attention to this in empirical research on brain development and pedagogy, right? In kind of mainstream American education. It's not that there's no attention to thinking about what kids are really going to be capable of handling. We will often kind of, St. Jerome people will often say, well, we don't give kids enough credit. We can actually challenge them more, we can expect more from them. And I think that's true. But that doesn't mean you can expect everything from everybody all the time.
Well, and whatever you can expect, you have to know what the road is from wherever they are, how to get there, and that's different.
This has to be part, right? This has to be part of a whole life plan. There has to be, I think, a greater amount of, again, mutual obligation, a sense of mutual obligation, a sense of planning, a sense of ongoing dialogue among the teachers or among the parent and among the parents and the families, trying to understand for real what kids are capable of, what they can offer, and what they can't. And to take them seriously and to challenge them, but also to be thinking really carefully as craftsmen of curriculum, right? Of the full scope of a child's education and trying to try to think through if sort of the central goal or among the central goals of Catholic education is to form people for culture of dialogue, which is the claim that this document makes. How are we doing that appropriately, in age-appropriate way at every stage along the path? How are we preparing them to have something worthy to bring to the classroom, right? To bring to the document? How are we preparing them little by little by little to be the sort of person who can enter into a whole adult dialogue as we're made with each other? I think, I don't even know if I'm that, but how can we organize education every single step along the way with that idea in mind? So it's not like you want to start doing seminars first graders. There's just a limited amount that they can do in the seminar. But I do think that the seminar is a beautiful, not necessarily the only, but a beautiful goal for the classroom. For what a school like would be like if we're forming for dialogue, right? If we have to have them in dialogue a lot. If we're going to train them to go out in the world to be able to have a real dialogue,
They have to have those habits, but you also think, what are the prerequisite habits, right? So you don't just drop in the seminar class and think yourself, if you're going to come in, again, with the idea that what's the product, right? What's the end goal? What's the cathedral? What's the student look like who can enter into authentic dialogue, right? And then you think to yourself, what are the prerequisites for that? And then it might not be that seminar or dialogue is the best way at a particular age to train the skills you need to participate in the seminar or the dialogue later. Maybe that there are other skills or other ways to do it, and that those things need to be attended to. I think too, what you said really early in the conversation of talking about integration, that there has to be a cognizant time and place. These are particular individuals in a particular community in a particular time, right? And you say and there are things about individual students who say this student has this particular personality or this way to get there. There's also these students are living in this time and place, and that gives them certain strengths and certain weaknesses that have to be addressed. And that's why it's not a uniform stamp it out, send it out, same old thing. If everybody just got in lockstep, we'd all be just doing just fine. This is this school in this community, in this time and place with this particular set of handicaps and strengths. And that needs to be approached this way, right? I love C.S. Lewis's phrase, the evolution of man, right? The appropriate sort of education and enculturation is this old bird teaching you birds how to fly, right? That there's a sense in which I'm bringing you into the life I already have. We already, for better or worse, right? To some degree, participating in that dialogue, that adult dialogue that we want them to have, and we're doing it, and we want to bring them into that life, right? We think it's worth doing, and we want to give them those things.
One earlier technique you already brought up, which was the recitation. So in the beginning, when students are young, you have them using the words of others. Right? They enter into the conversation, they learn how to recite. And for those of you who don't know what the St. Jerome Academy history recitation is, it's not just that they go and memorize a bunch of quotes from history and then sort of, kind of spew them all out in a string. It's far more thoughtful and integrated than that. It is a walk through U.S. history story. It is the narrative of U.S. history, and it's acted out. Students are actually in the garb of the period. of the person that they're speaking for. Sometimes it's done individually, sometimes it's done in small groups. There are snippets of song, there are parts of speeches, there are parts of all kinds of things that it's composed as a beautiful whole. But these are not those students' words. We're not asking them to come up with these things. We're asking them to understand what these things mean, how they fit into the history of our nation. And that's appropriate for that age level. And in a similar way, the kind of seminar that you would do when discussing, say, a novel or work of fiction, and the kind of seminar that you would do when you're exploring something in natural philosophy in a laboratory setting, or whether you're teaching someone how to speak Latin, or whether you're forming someone in vocal performance, are all different kinds of dialogues that you're going to do. They're ideally suited to the subject material that you're trying to have a conversation about. And so the conversation isn't always a conversation that happens with two people speaking together. If you're thinking about this on the soccer field, the conversation is a physical one between two people trying to learn skills. And the same thing if you're singing, it's a conversation between the sounds that you're producing and what it sounds like with other people. And if you're in a studio doing art, it's a conversation between what you're seeing and what you're rendering. So there's different kinds of conversations that are suited to different subjects. And what's really required is simply thoughtfulness about how you want to do that. What is the best way to help form students who can, as Hipland says, read well, write well, speak well, think well.
So, yeah, something about what you're talking about is an important observation, I think, in education. That it's easy to get into the idea that if you want a student to be able to perform some kind of activity, then all of your time and effort with that student should be focused on things that are very obviously the components of that activity. So what you're pointing out is, right, and so in a way, so I said the seminar is a really good goal for training young people to be in a culture of dialogue, right? And I believe that that's true. But there's a danger of taking that in a simple-minded way as the only preparation that's needed somehow. But right, what you're saying is, I think, right, that part of what you need, right, that this document, again, very wisely, very beautifully points out ways in which you need a habit of openness. You need a disposition of genuine openness to other people and to their differences from yourself. Well, how do you get that? I think a lot of schools think you get that just by kind of exposing students to a whole lot of different viewpoints, and you kind of pack them with a book full of different voices from as many widely divergent, diverse, various perspectives, cultures, time periods, whatever, identities. Yeah, and that's going to achieve it, right? Because they'll just they'll get used to that, and they won't be so scared of it. And maybe there's a certain truth to that. I don't know, but I think there's a difference between encountering something that's true, right? It's factual but true, and loving it, and even being capable of loving it. Big difference between that, right? There's a big difference between being able to answer perfectly on a test, all the right answers about what somebody from some other culture would believe about something that you don't, a belief you don't share, on the one hand, and on the other hand, actually having a heart for love for that person where you could really enter into a dialogue. Okay? And in order to love difference, it seems to me, you have to have some ways of, on the one hand, right, not seeing it as corrosive to yourself and things that are your most wholesome life identity, as this document would have it. not corrosive, but in order to see it as not corrosive, you have to have some kind of constructive experience of difference, right? And so when you talk about song, right? And song, the practice of singing together with other people, right? As a practice of dialogue in a way, right? Well, you're not necessarily doing dialogic singing when you do that, but what you're having a really deep experience of, whether you talk about it or not, is that different voices, that different tones can in fact find a way to get in tune with each other. And that kind of deep experience creates analogy, I would argue, creates forms in the soul that then allow you analogously a greater possibility of finding, of having a habit that's going to allow you to find the path to a loving kind of sonorousness with somebody else.
And that seems to be a way in which the two topics we're going to talk about tonight are integrated.
Yeah.
Right. And in other words, you have to have the experience, that dialogue, that differences have the possibility of being integrated in something which is in a certain way a unity. Right. There's a way in which polyphonic singing does that. Right. It's not even that you're in different tones in the same syllable. You could be singing different syllables at different times with different tones, and you find that there's a sort of unitive whole to a well-composed piece of polyphonic music, whether that be symphonic or whether it be instruments or voices. And there's a way in which disparate observations in the natural philosophy classroom are illuminating. You think to yourself, I would have never seen it from that perspective, but knowing what I already know and then getting that contribution from another student who saw it another way completely changes and deepens the way I understand this part of the natural world. That those experiences are healthy and maybe the most preparatory for entering into a sort of mature, flourishing human adult dialogue, because you can see that in fact, in that way, it's not opposed to you, it's not corrosive to you, and you have sort of faith that these things are unified, even if you don't see how, right? The sort of way in which you say to yourself, I know all things are one in Christ, and that's true abstractly. I haven't put that all together yet. And it'll be a while. I have all of eternity, I hope, if I make it that far, right? But I pursue in the confidence that these things will come together with me because they're true, and I'll either find the ways in which I'm in error, or I will see more deeply and see the unity that underlies the diversity that I see. Right? That's a really helpful habit.
This seems like another kind of practical aspect that's really important for the future of Catholic, right? That a re-centralizing of music education, a re-centralizing of aesthetic education, generally speaking, in the curriculum. I think art and music and even PE, right, have kind of gotten marginal. Physical education and gymnasium, right? As a thoughtful enterprise, right? It's something that again that understands itself to be in relation to the other subjects, right, in some really fundamental way, and obligated to them, and that they have obligations to it, right? That sort of centralization, that kind of integration of what are right now treated as kind of marginal subjects, right? And I think, or in languages, learning a language other than your own is another thing that often gets lost in these schools nowadays.
And we know this in adults in real life, right? That, like you said earlier, sometimes we think the only thing we need to achieve a certain goal or a certain skill is to give them all the prerequisite knowledge or skills to allow them to have all the tools to put it all together and get this thing. But as adults, we know sometimes if I'm beating my head against the wall and I'm going down the same path, what I need to do is like go mow the lawn. Or so, I think we'll do something else. Sometimes I do something else that's formative to a different part of my being. And then in fact, I will do better at this thing, or I will more easily acquire the skills that in some ways, working on different aspects of my humanity and whether it be my understanding or my physicality or my aesthetic sense, can in fact not only sort of in content wise, because you might learn things that are then applicable, but also just as a human being, as an integral unity, sometimes one needs to do some of those exercises that are hard to do and come back.
Well, imagine how great it would be to have a spiritual director who is thinking about that, who has a deep wisdom and is thinking about that for your life, right? You're in dialogue with the spiritual director and this mentor. And this is the person who's thinking in this sideways way about how Merrill needs to get where he needs to be in spiritual life and relationship with other people, right? And who when you say I'm banging my head against the wall, has been waiting for this moment because Greg says yes, yeah, you need to go mow the lawn, right? Imagine if you had somebody like that in your life who's thinking in that way about the program of your life, right? About all the parts of you and the ways that those parts push on each other, right, and shape each other. We need to be that. We need to be that. Catholic schools, Catholic teachers, Catholic parents. We need to be that. We've got to have our kids on a program, and we've got to be trying. Not that I'm saying everybody's going to have the perfect program, and we're not all the perfectly wise, saintly spiritual director. I think we need to be striving for it. I think we need to be thinking about how the different parts of students' lives are going to fit together. We need to really be thinking about those sideways ways, all the pieces of them together, even to kind of get off the track in order to get them on the right track.
But that, of course, takes the mindset of a spiritual director, which means sort of Catholic prayer and sacrifice, right? That's not an easy task, right? It takes a lot of work, but the fruit is good, right? And sometimes you don't know what to do with either yourself or with other people, right? But sometimes when that is your goal, we're all not perfect, and you're able to say to a student, I see you banging your head against the wall. I actually think having had this relationship with you, you should do this thing. And then probably it's the right call. Right. The fruit in the life of both the teacher and the student is phenomenal. And even if you fail more times than you succeed, the fact that that's the goal of both of the teacher, but also that the institution is set up in such a way that it helps the teacher to do that. One of my experiences as a student and in teaching other places, that a lot of times great teachers are like salmon swimming upstream. They're so often struggling with the structures, and the structures are made to help them in certain ways. But there was a sense in which you were sort of looking at that as the teacher's vocation, right? As that spiritual mentality, and that the structure of the school and the way in which the school set up was organic and integral and made to support that community of learners and the faculty that then had the wisdom and were in the dialogue to be able to turn around and have something to pour out to the students, and that concludes the students that would bear great fruit, I think. And that's the challenge, but also the joy.
And this is the challenge to school administrators as well. That's right. This isn't the job that can just be kind of offloaded under the academic education. That's right. School administrator can't just be a responsible keeper of budgets and HR, and although those are necessary skills, absolutely can't have an effective school without that. However, there also has to be a programmatic mindfulness about how to create a stream that's running in the right direction with respect to these difficult, intangible, sideways, complicated, very mission-driven aspects of what a Catholic school needs to be. Be able to face the challenges that are coming at them in the next 4 years.
And one part is that the fruit of that is a lot of joy in the difficult, in the abject difficulty, in the frustration and the exhaustion of that. There can be a lot of joy, and that's great for teachers and students.
Can I bring us back to the dialogue points we were making earlier? I'm sorry, I think that was very, I had something to add to that too, but I want to come back to this other point about dialogue because I want to address once again the quote from Pope Francis. And I'm going to go back to the music analogy. Right. So if you're the tenor in a 4-part polyphonic piece, but you don't know your part, or you can't execute your part well, then the resulting music isn't going to sound good. And I think that might be an analogy for what Pope Francis said, that you have to have an identity before you can enter into a dialogue. You actually have to know something about your part. You have to have, as you said earlier, you have to be able to possess something before you can give it. If you're not self-possessed, possessed of some kind of of knowledge or contribution that you can make to a dialogue, then probably your best role is to listen a lot, right? Because you need to learn something before you can say something. And
even that, by the way, is self-knowledge and self-protection. Know that that's the situation you're in, sorry.
right, well, that's why we have, coaching from adults to let you know that that statement might not yet have all the information. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. This is sort of what I said in the beginning when the second point, which is that those minimum of 2 speakers need to have some personal contribution to make. And that's also a responsibility of a school in creating dialogue. It's to give students a voice with which to participate in dialogue. And so, again, as you were saying, again, it's unreasonable to expect students to observe, listen, and read about these dialogues for 8, 12 years, and then launch and just immediately be able to take up the role of interlocutor on one side of the conversation without ever having actually practiced that. And seminars, laboratories with the correct safety equipment, a whiteboard where you're just messing around with a marker and an equation gives you a safe place to fail. In a sense, a place to learn how to make some tentative answers, to propose some ideas, and maybe get a chuckle from your classmates, but get others to chime in and help out and create some kind of collaboration, create some kind of dialogue in which the result in the end is that everyone knows a little bit more about than they do.
Yeah, I think the humility, right, and enough of a relationship and already being in dialogue in some way that you feel comfortable putting something forward that is imperfect, right, in order to be made better by the dialogue is something that's really necessary.
And that's where we need that intentional culture where a student doesn't feel like giving the wrong answer in a classroom or in a seminar, saying the wrong thing is going to be a huge embarrassment, or they can't afford to expose themselves like that. They have to become, in a sense, comfortable with making some steps, and that also should be a way of entering into the humility required to come into a dialogue that you're not fully.
This is my greatest strength as a teacher. I just get up there and make mistakes a lot and make them feel really comfortable. But that's right. You have to show them by example, right? That you can survive this kind of thing, right? It's really important.
So these things have to be, right, these things have to be balanced carefully against each other. The prudential work of an administrator, of a teacher, the balance between one thing that I think is really important, and again, really encouraging about Physicist teaching, the idea that I take from this in part that the future of Catholic education needs to not be embarrassed, not be afraid of doubling down on answering deeply into the question with students, the question, what does it mean to be Catholic, right? And answering deeply into the activity of giving back to students something that many of them have never really received. The cultural and spiritual and intellectual patrimony of the Catholic Church, and the centrality of that. I really think it's amazing how clear and how upfront this document is about that idea, right? That there is such a thing as Catholic identity, and unless you got it, it's useless to even try to enter into dialogue. Can't even do it. And so I think the future of Catholic schools in part is a renewed sense that we need to really focus on making sure that our kids in all aspects of their education are fully formed in an authentically, hopefully, joyfully, distinctively Catholic identity as we prepare them for dialogue with difference. part of that, right? Part of that is part of what it is to be Catholic is the sense of a quest of knowledge, right? Of the kind of the partialness of any of our knowledge with respect to the divine mind. Right, and so that necessity, experiment, and failure on the one hand, but always in the context of the sense that there really is something to be discovered, right? That the whiteboard isn't the reality, right? The real reality, right? Real reality is this is medium, and I put my marks on that medium, and maybe those marks line up with reality, maybe they don't, but there is real reality to discover.
And I judge the quality of my marks insofar as they conform, as they correspond appropriately or inappropriately to
Yeah, and it made sense, right? Catholics was a challenge to recommit to our sense that Catholic anthropology, Catholic sense of reality is real reality.
And that it gets rid of a lot of fear, right? It's for us to jump over because faith has no fear of reason, it seeks out and trusts in it, right? That there's not this opposition. But again, that's one of those things that seeming opposition to faith and reason, if the Catholic school is doing its job right, is another question that doesn't come up. Because it's clear to the student that those things work in concert, right? That there's a quest, that there's a goal, that you know what you want to get to. You have heaven as a goal, you have knowledge as a goal, you have the truth, informing yourself of the truth and living your vocation as a goal. And that you have confidence that you will progress towards that goal despite your weaknesses, the failings, the falls, all that stuff, right? That because you've seen in your own classroom with your own teachers and in dialogue with your fellow classmates, fall, failure, stumble, trip up, oops, vacation, holiday, forgetting, dog ate my homework, all of the above, right? And still, you progress towards understanding reality, right? And coming together in a way that in a community where all of you are pursuing the truth.
Yeah, and not just understanding it, but loving it as you need it.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think that's so important. That's a term that, it can get squishy, right? You talk about love and education, and I think there's a danger of that, I suppose. But I also think there's a huge danger in forgetting. And that's language that I often do not find, or that I do not often find in writing about, talking about Catholic education, in principles of what the point of Catholic education should be, right? And I think that's really dangerous. I think it's it forgets something. Because as you say, the real goal of all this, right, what we really want to form kids into isn't presidents and senators, or even, really good priests, right? It's saints. It's people we're going to be with forever. Right? And so any school, if it doesn't understand itself primarily as a school of love, I think fails to understand its ultimate. Now again, love is a complicated word, especially in the English language, it can mean a whole lot of things. But I think if we can get a right understanding of what that means, I think that's got to be, again, for the future of our education system. We need to bring that back to the center of our understanding.
Well, I mean, the Catholics, the saints are wonderful because if there's one group of diverse personalities, it's the Trinity saints, right? It's what a wildly disparate group of people, right? And yet, right, they're unified in we have a music vision, right? And their faithfulness and love of God and complete love of God and their lives should be emulated. And in some ways gives us hope, right? To see that in fact that's something that can be achieved. Sort of not just despite, but in some ways, sort of God's plan that in that diversity of personalities, all different aspects of different people and all of the ways they come together. But that's what we're called to. Think about that, that way. They don't all become one homogenous type of person, right? When you stamp out the themes always exactly the same. That's the way it works.
Something that's so powerful to me about this vision in the party. So Dante, he represents purgatory and heaven, well, the afterlife generally, even hell too. He goes to great pains to preserve the distinctive particularity of everybody for eternity. Right? God knows you and you particularly and distinctively.
For better or worse.
For better or worse. That's great. And that doesn't disappear in us. We don't all just become blobs of light or that sticks with you. And it's all that difference is necessary. Right? It's each of it, it's a necessary kind of modulation that forms the total sentiment of what happened. That's the most beautiful. Right. And what that is, like, it's the greatest love is a love where both people are going to bring something to each other. They're going to be obligated to each other, but they're also going to have something to give each other. And I think that's the fullest kind of friendship, and the fullest kind of love. Right? We only have that with respect to God because He gave it to us and we're giving back to Him. But with respect to each other, that's really important as well. That we're trying to, we talk about Catholic identity as a thing. We talk about reality as a thing. But then that also needs to be balanced in the school with a respect for the distinctiveness. And that balance, again, is a very difficult balance to strike. Right? You're trying to lead students into what they share, in a sense, an identity that they all share, a knowledge, a reality that's outside of them, that's just what it is. Right? But then also a sense, a lively sense, that each of them really has something in this educational enterprise that they're going to bring, that they're going to build, that they're going to give back, that they're obligated to give back to the school and to each other, and that they're going to be helped by the educational enterprise to discover that.
I do love that in the sort of this is very localized communities which are very close to you. And you said something earlier before we got in here about sort of loving people whose humanity you have to continue to deal with, which I think is a really great. It's a beautiful phrase. So I'm stealing it. Sorry, but in other words, that you have to care for people who then you have to see again tomorrow, right? And then we have to struggle with the fact that they grate on you sometimes, right? And that you continue to love them in an authentic way that may in fact be sacrificial in something, but that then also teaches you something, right? That there's something really healthy about that, and that sort of brings the distinctiveness and the unity together, right? That we're trying to do good for each other and bring each other along in this, and our respective strengths and weaknesses both help and harm us in that endeavor, right? And then we have to figure out how to work on those things, and maybe even the fact that our disparate personalities assist us in sort of working with this things we have to fix ourselves. That's really important.
Well, and one last practical thing that's kind of been on my mind as we've been talking, with respect to what we do in the life of this. I remember the first time, it wasn't until I was in college that I ever saw teachers get into an argument with each other that they were both happy to be having. A debate, right? A dialogue, but a debate. And that was it was a striking moment to me. The teachers, these two experts in Shakespeare, disagreed with each other and having a really intense argument with each other about it, but they were so happy to be having it and so grateful to each other for it. This is another thing I wonder whether it would be good for Catholic schools to think more about this, right? If we're forming students for a culture of dialogue, would it be good to expose them more, to think more about the value of exposing students to being observers of fruitful dialogue, fruitful disagreement, perhaps even fruitful argument? That's something I don't see happening very often in a lot of countries. Even at the university level, I think it's actually pretty rare for students to be set in front of a group of teachers who actually conduct a dialogue with each other, actually have an argument, a fruitful argument, or a conversation with each other. So we talk about kids, at a young age, we sort of have them learn the language of other people, have them imitate writing styles, perhaps, that they should admire. You have them imitating music, right? That they hear others sing and then they sing back and so on and so forth. But do they even have models of really engaged, fruitful, lively arguments? How much dialogue do they even receive in their lives? And I think this is a common observation about our time. There's no dialogue out there. There's just, my thing and everybody else is totally nuts and evil. Right? But and that's so much of at least kids who are linked into social media. That's so much of what they're seeing. So how are they ever going to be formed to dialogue? I think that that's another thing that sort of
I think that allows you to put in perspective the right role of expertise too. Right, like you said, two Shakespeare experts who are experts in their field, still having experience about something. Right? I remember going to the first couple of scientific conferences I went to as a graduate student being like that. It was both glorious and frightening to see many people who are respected in their field wholly disagreeing about something and getting into rather heated discussions about these things, right? And I think it gives you the right perspective of the authority of expertise, but also the liveliness of human knowledge and how those things are intertwined with each other. And I think that's a perspective that's easy to lose, and that our students are not exposed to. It wouldn't be hard. We all have. I mean, even in a school faculty, we have to disagree about it because we can bring those things in a fruitful and effective way in front of the students. I don't think it's so easy, but hard.
Yeah, but in order to do it well, you've got to be mindful about promoting the kinds of relationships among teachers that will allow that to happen and actually lead. So you got to have an idea of this sort of formative aspect of the teacher relationships, building up that life together.
I was gonna say, you can construct that field in the soul, as you said earlier, by having these debates between experts in a field. And I saw something similar when I was in college. I had two faculty came in on different days to give their take on the Drake equation, which is the probability that there's extraterrestrial life. And one came in and gave all the reasons why it's absolutely certain that there are aliens out there. And the other came in and said, the exact opposite. Here are all the reasons why life is unique. Right? But at the end of the day, that expert dialogue has no impact on my life, other than it's a fruitful way of seeing how two experts are. There is going to come a point in which our identity as Catholics comes against a different viewpoint that challenges some fundamental things that we believe to be true. And the Vatican does very carefully talk about how you walk that line, how you have those dialogues. But for us specifically as educational communities, I think there's a couple of principles that we should think about pretty strongly. And the first is to focus first on what we believe to be healthy, fruitful works. So if I were to look at this from math or natural philosophy, to spend the first laying the groundwork of foundational mathematics or natural philosophy, which is correct, before we look at things which were not correct. And the same thing would be true in literature, right? We would want to look at truly beautiful, wonderful works before we looked at works that had some serious questions, that raised serious questions. And the second would be the amount of time that you spend with these two. I think there is a tendency, there's a certain attractiveness in some schools to say, like, let's look at this crazy text, and this crazy text, and this crazy text. Look at all these weird theories of science that failed. And you spend all this time sort of looking at the things that had flaws, and you don't really look at the healthy, beautiful, integrated stuff as much. So the precedence of looking at that material help develop your own sense of what is good and true and beautiful first. And then when you have this identity, you're starting to come into possession of it, and you have some way to, and you come up against some of these arguments of, well, what about this? And now you're at a point where you're actually curious, you actually want to know, how do I respond to that? Or I want to know, why isn't that the right way to solve this problem? Or why didn't that work out in science? Now you have enough of a foundation that the answers fit into your full understanding of this kind of unified knowledge that we want.
Well, I think it's time to open this dialogue up, and see whether, see whether the audience would like to.
Does anyone have any questions?
Can I not say anything, or do I just have to talk really loud?
Anyone have a question? Check the lines.
Anything to share? Well, I got a question for the audience then. What experiences have you had of times where you thought something really beautiful was happening in your family life, in your schools, where something you'd like to hold up as maybe where the future of Catholic education should be, what we need to do more of in terms of integral education or closer dialogue? Help us out here. Thank you.
Actually, that kind of leads to a question too, that the dialogue between the parents and the school. And I think this document really, brought up parents as the primary educators, right? And so my background is homeschooling, but now I'm doing a hybrid school. And, my kids have all gone to high school. And I find, like, how would you suggest, and how does St. Jerome Institute encourage that dialogue between the parents? And because once the kids leave the school, like it's like the teachers become the like the teachers are the main educators, right? And the parents can kind of tend to put that responsibility onto the teachers and and I've done it, I'm guilty of it, like, okay, I'm not teaching them writing anymore because you are, right? I'm paying you to do that. But more so than just writing or just academics, but that dialogue of the integral person, like the service projects you talk about, like that does affect the family. It takes time out of our time on the weekends together, or, yes, those sports that could be important to a certain child or something. So anyway, just your ideas and thoughts on that would be great.
I guess my first response is that you're still teaching them whether or not their writing homework's important or not. Even if we're teaching, right, that your attitude towards what goes on in the school teaches them a lot. It's funny because we spend a lot of time with them in the classroom, doing particular things with them, and there's a way in which we're partnering with you. At the same time, as teachers, anybody who's taught knows that there's the character of the student so much comes from the family, and there's for a lot of good reasons, right? There's a way in which that stands on the student in a way that's I'm definitely secondary, right? And their parents teach them in a primary way. And it's sort of obvious to the teacher in a lot of ways that's primary. So, but the way in which you address with them their responsibilities, even if you're not still teaching them writing, I think it's still, everything you do teaches, right? And it's that's my first response.
Yeah, I would say again, this is another future challenge that's really important, right? For the future of Catholic education, that I do think Catholic schools need to be much more mindful of the fact that gap between the primary educators of the children, the parents, and the people who spend the most time educating them, right, in a formal sense, is really big these days. And this document actually addresses that there's a growing sense of a kind of breakdown of the contract, right? Of the sort of spiritual contract that needs to be there between families and schools. And that's failing, that's falling apart. But I think it's not just on the families. I think it's very much, it needs to become a part of the life of the school. That if the school really believes it has a vision that's authentically Catholic, right? And it really has a sense of how to bring people more deeply into that, that needs to be offered to the parents in some way, in some really robust way. And again, this is still to be discovered, exactly how to do this, because everybody's super busy, right? And so on. But you know, I think parents, we are as malformed almost as the kids are now, right? We're in the same culture that they're in. I don't see any guarantee that we're in general gonna be more authentically Catholic than our kids are. So, right? So how are we even gonna know what the school ought to be giving our kids, or how to choose the right school, or whatever? So yeah, I think it's really important, and the schools need to make that more a part of the life of the school, is opening up, finding ways to bring families in and offer families a way to enter into the life of formation in Catholic identity that the kids are receiving.
I'd also add, because you asked specifically, what the St. Jerome's do in that area. And so the first thing I would say is that delegating certain responsibilities of teaching doesn't take you away as the primary educator. You've selected the piano teacher because maybe you don't play piano, or maybe your child doesn't respond well when you teach piano, right? But will respond perfectly fine when the tutor comes, right? So delegation in and of itself, delegating away your primary responsibility. But then secondly, concretely, St. Jerome Academy has the Parents Book Club. The St. Jerome Institute has coffees with the headmaster. There are picnics, there are socials, there's game nights.
There's the Society for the Renewal.
Right, so bringing parents into those dialogues and filling them in on what's going on. Newsletters that come out. We have the headmaster's newsletter at SJI. We have Box at SJA. So you're aware of sort of the logistics of what's going on in the school, but also both of those newsletters, they're not just a list of events and when this is due and what's going to happen. There's just some joyful, beautiful things that went on in the life of the school. So both of those, both levels of St. Jerome's want the parents, the families to be part of the community. I mean, that is the community that we're building. Yeah. And so, to the extent possible, without, of course, putting on something every night of the week so that you feel like this, I'm getting emails every day from 5 teachers and I'm getting, all these invitations. Well, I can't possibly do all that. We don't want people to feel overwhelmed, but we want there to be multiple ways for families to feel like I am part of this entire community educational project. I might not know what's happening, in Latin tomorrow, but I know that my student is getting Latin, and I'm confident that that Latin is being taught in a way that's integrated with the rest of the program and is an important part of this entire formation of my child. And that's what I'm asking of the school.
And I think it's incumbent on both on teachers, on parents, and on administrators to resist the temptation to think about those kinds of events. I think it's really important to think to yourself, okay, parents are the primary educators of their students, the community of learners, the faculty, and that gap between the parents and education needs to be closed. It's not something that would be nice to have. It's essential. The school is alive or dead based on whether that's happening or not. And then like, yeah, spaghetti dinner, like whatever, and it's true, like you can't make every event, but in other words, those kinds of events, they have to be recommitted to by teachers who would like to go home, who would like to stay for a 7 p.m. or 8 o'clock thing, right? For parents who have other things to do, right? For administrators who are like, we got enough things to plan already. We don't need 27 more events, right? The delegation is good, right? But that those things which can be easily labeled extracurricular, extra, are in some ways not just, required. I've come and attended, check my name from the box. This is something I'm supposed to do, but it gives life to the school you've chosen for your children and your family to be involved in. And those are life-giving activities. So to recommit yourself in all aspects of the school community to entering into those things and treating them as a way to be a living organ in this integrated school, right? That's the time you get to sort of casually bump into your student's teacher or whatever, and not have a full-on parent meeting right there, because teachers, that's hard for teachers sometimes. But to just enter into that dialogue in all kinds of different ways. It's really, it's not an extracurricular. It's essential.
And recommit ourselves.
That's right.
To integrating ourselves into our community, right? Into into our schools, into our parishes, and making those things the center of our lives. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that's really cool that you can do. That's maybe in some ways more interesting or glamorous than going to, a book discussion at the school or a picnic at the school or whatever. But, the deep value of committing ourselves to those bonds and obligations to each other, I think is really hard to weigh too heavily in the formation of young people and the formation of the Catholic future. And, one last thing about this, such a good question, thank you. I also think it's important to note that it can be part of the program legitimately, right? To look at somebody else and say, I really admire that person. And I want my kid, part of my program for my kid is for them to be spending time with that person, right? But you've got to get to know those people in order to be in that kind of relationship. So it's not just, well, this is a paid employee and, I sort of hired them, but, right? I don't even know what they're up to. And I hear these reports from my kid but I don't know, my disposition, I could try to think of it, as you don't fault a president for sending an ambassador, right? The ambassador is a really important part of the work of an executive, right? And as a head of family, right, parents they're executives, they've got a lot they're dealing with. And so they've got to choose ambassadors and they've got to choose people to do stuff with their kids. Homeschooling is wonderful, but not everybody's going to run their families that way. And so, but then the child really has to respect that relationship. It has to be taught to respect. And that I think, it takes some deliberate work on the part of the parents to treat as sacred in a sense that bond between the parent and the teacher. That the teacher really is an ambassador for me. And if they disobey the teacher or disrespect the teacher, they are disrespecting me because I chose the teacher. Right. And I think that kind of work at the home environment level can also be very, very helpful for students. I think it can be really helpful for students to flourish in their schools, to remember and to really feel that connectedness and that sense of, that the school really is a part of the mission of the family's intertwined with it, but it's intertwined back with the family too.
One of the glorious things for me is that I see, and especially if I'm having to be my colleagues so that teach at the academy, seeing that there are just some things which I don't have, that some of my colleagues do. And I'm in some ways extremely joyful that my children get to learn that from them because they get to have them as teachers, because I know they need it. That's a central part of their education, and I don't have it as well as I'd like to, but this person does. And they will get a chance to experience that from that person. That's a great joy and a relief to be able to say, that's something they can do better than I can, and they'll learn from them. Right? And it's a great thing for students to see.
We have some really amazing and wise people in this audience. I would love to hear from more of them. And I saw a hand up over there.
You've mentioned a couple times the importance of reality and imagination. And, in my work, it's just dawning on me how profound the loss of the Catholic imagination has been for the church. I think it's greater than we have understood it to be. And as the bishops are engaging in a Eucharistic revival, it's occurring to all of us that doubling and tripling down on catechesis is not getting us there. What would you say to bishops, to school leaders, about how they can cultivate a Catholic sacramental imagination? What are some specific ways that schools can begin the very arduous work of doing that? But where do we begin?
Well, you already heard a little of what I think, and I'll restate it again. I think it will be crucial for the life of Catholics in the next generations for schools to re-centralize aesthetic education. to re-centralize beauty in education, to make central to curricula, to the plan of every day, to the overarching plan for a whole scope of a child's education and education in beauty. And right, and beauty as understood through the amazingly rich Catholic artistic and musical tradition. But then also, so teaching them to sing, not just to hear song, but to be makers of song. Teaching them to draw, not just to appreciate a beautiful drawing, but to be able to make as beautiful a drawing as they can. Because I don't think you really will understand the depths of those things until you participate in them, even imperfectly. And so I think musical education, artistic education, is the back and the center of building that too.
I think too, give them a lot of raw material with which to imagine, right? To continue to show them, because the imagination is one of those things where it draws on memory and sense experience in order to sort of construct these things, right? The things that are in the imagination are first in the senses in certain ways, and so to have them participate in those things, to have them maybe imitate first, right? You were talking about imitating the history of education, imitating in a lot of ways is we're saying this is paradigmatic, experience it and imitate it, right? And that goes from, Edward and I also think the second order parts of the differential equations are beautiful and symmetric and have something, offer the world, to show them that beauty and symmetry as well as have, and then participate in doing those things and all the way up through the sacramental level and the liturgical level that they should be experiencing the liturgy so that they can, and participating in an authentic way so that they can imagine being a part of that. And like you're talking about with the Eucharist, if their whole self involved in that is something that to continue to reveal these things to them so that they have the raw material with which to, and then with which to use their skills to produce those things, right? And show them things that are good and beautiful, and get them involved.
This is something I love about Syndrome Academy. My children were imitating God's handiwork in rendering, right? In trying to draw from nature, and they did as well as they could as first graders, right? And if you can stick with that, right? You can really stay committed to it. As an educational institution, as Catholic institutions, as if you're at the level of a bishop or an archbishop overseeing a whole Catholic school system, if you can really commit to that and you can really stick with it and you can really encourage it all the way through, I think like with song or musical instrument or like with mathematics, right? These are difficult things sometimes and they're kind of scary to people only because people just don't do them very much, right? And or the way that they do them is really fragmentary and it's all over the place. And so they get to be adults and they're like, I can't draw, I can't sing, I can't do that, right? But if you really can stick with it and you can find a way to help them to love it while they're learning to do it and to appreciate how much better other people do it, while then, I think you will have a really different sort of people in the church, a generation or two down the road, who I think will be fortified in a profound way for the renaissance of Catholic culture that's come.
I would add also, this comes back to one of the things that I was saying before about sticking with healthy choices first, before you look at some of the more problematic things. Our culture is very cynical, it's very jaded, and it instrumentalizes education. That bleeds into everything that happens in a school. Even if you're not paying attention all the time, it just comes in, right? It's just because that's what we're surrounded by. So if you allow your students to choose, a New York Times bestseller, you're going to read, some story about some broken lives of people who nonetheless found some way to soldier on in some personal meaning in their life. But if you ask them to read With God in Russian and challenge them to look at something beautiful. You can read about brokenness and danger and horror, and how a very healthy and spiritual and beautiful response might look, right? So presenting them with those materials and then helping them to interpret them, to understand that beauty. Your own love for your subject can be infectious. That doesn't mean that you're going to turn every student into a math major, but you don't have to turn math into this instrumentalized list of technical things to learn that's going to give them a job with labor market value, which is what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's stated goal for education is. That's what education is about. Get a job. But that's not what we believe education, that's what we believe formation is about. So if you want to form a soul in beauty, you have to keep them in beauty. You have to look at beautiful things and explain to them in the beginning why they're beautiful. And they're like, oh, here it is, this on here again going on about beauty and this thing. I don't see any beauty in this. This is boring. But if you constantly expose them to that, then just like they're constantly exposed to cynicism and jaded brokenness in their world, it starts to leak in. And then someone will challenge that thing that they learned and they didn't like in your you were teaching it, and they'll say like, oh yeah, Odyssey, that's boring old Greek story. And they're like, no, actually, it's actually pretty good. They will pick up that argument later on and defend it.
And at the very least, you may not turn everyone into a math major. They may not even be able to appreciate or love math level that maybe their math teacher does. But they will know somebody out there finds something beautiful and lovely in this subject, and they will have been exposed to that person and loved and trusted them. And that's something wonderful, right? They can't just write it off and say, well Mr. Trudeau thinks it's something beautiful about mathematics and partial differential equations. And I know him, and he's tried to show me over and over again, and I'm not sure I got it, but out there is somebody who is excellent at it, and it's beautiful, right? The way I could look at a ballet or an excellent professional athlete and go, I can't do that, but that person excels and it's beautiful, right? And even if they don't become proficient in all those things, they won't be exposed to that excellence. I think that's part of what makes it fun.
So I think we got maybe 2 or 3 minutes here. I'd love to hear one or two more comments. Yeah. You got to read it.
2 or 3 minutes. Okay, my wife has warned me, I have to keep it short. 2 or 3 questions. Okay. So Dan, I think you had asked a question if any of us has experienced something at home that was particularly good or striking or valuable. And I just wanted to remark on something. It was really my wife's initiative, but Catholic devotions at home with our children. So praying the rosary, doing the Stations of the Cross, the meditation on the 5 wounds of our Lord, and the points that Merrill was making and Dan, that you and Edward were making about the tangible. There's something about the tangible, about the seeing paintings, statues. Those things draw in, particularly young, but really all of us, into the devotional life and into the dialogue with heaven, with the angels, with the saints, with Our Lady. And I read recently how Cardinal Newman, when he was discerning whether to swim the Tiber and give up his life as an Oxford Don, that he would sneak away to a Catholic church in East London with Italian and Irish immigrants. And the thing that struck him was the Catholic devotional life. And it hit him as an epiphany. They're part of a family. They're in dialogue with heaven. And that aspect of Catholic identity is something that I think could bear lots of fruit, including, Ms. Donahue, what you asked about, with inspiring people to draw them into the sacraments and produce art and devotion to the sacraments, because it's tangible. It connects art, beauty, the heart, and the dialogue with heaven. And it's my understanding you guys already do devotions at St. Jerome Institute. I don't know what all you do. I know you do lauds and other things, but I'd like to hear, what kind of devotions you guys do at the Institute. Or any other reaction you may have.
Yeah, well, I'd like to keep it out in the audience. Has anybody at St. Jerome Institute, anybody with kids or who teaches at St. Jerome Institute or at St. Jerome Academy? Is there an example of something like this that you think is beautiful and powerful that your school or your children's school?
I probably don't need a mic, but I'll use it anyway. So I am one of the math teachers at St. Jerome Institute. And something I think really beautiful every year, and I'm biased because this is a personal devotion of mine, but in December, we have a devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so we bring in a big canvas image of her, and we have a bunch of roses, and we sing some songs in Spanish. And we teach the students how one of the things you can do is, if you have an intention, think about that. And if you would like to, then you can take a rose and you can present it to Our Lady and sort of offer this intention at her feet. And if you want to touch the image, you can, or you can pause for a moment in front. And I just think it's a beautiful moment that we have every year. And it's really beautiful to see some of the students that you would least expect to be moved by it, to have, even though you're standing behind them, you can tell they're having this, they really are offering something, and they're really having a beautiful moment with this image. So that's my personal favorite.
That sounds like the future of Catholic schools to me. Thanks, all. I think we're at the end of our time. So thanks for coming out. Are you gonna wrap up?
So before we formally close in prayer, I just want to invite everyone to our next, or not our, because the English department's not doing that one, but to the Society's next event, and that's November 18th with Michael Ortner and Peter Crawford, and that's on campus, but in Heritage Hall. And I want to thank our speakers for their time and for their wisdom. So thank you very much.
And thank you to the English department.
Yes, and thank you to Monica for setting up such a beautiful event. So, and thank you all for coming. So a final prayer. We beg a final prayer.
Yeah.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving Father, we thank you so much for this evening, for our great dialogue and discussion. Thank you for the wisdom that you have imparted to us this evening. Please grant that as we leave here this night, that we might go forth in your love and your grace to better lead those children you've entrusted to us towards knowing you and loving you. We ask this in all things in the name of Jesus Christ, your Son, as we pray. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, world without end. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Yeah.
Really is my favorite thing.
I like it.